Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, my name's Rosalind Cook. I'd like to begin tonight's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and by paying my and our respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to King & Wood Mallesons for making this space available to us for free and on short notice. We're very grateful that we've been able to draw together so many people in such a short amount of time. I should also alert people to the fact that we are recording tonight's proceedings and we do intend to broadcast them, so if that's a concern for you, please be aware. Now, I'm here tonight in my capacity as the National Vice President of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. We're a large volunteer organisation founded in 1992 and now representing over 3,000 members from across Australia. We have active state, national and territory committees, and our backgrounds and areas of practice are diverse. But what unites us is our passion for and belief in the importance of human rights and in the importance of human rights standards. Those standards are only more important at times when they are under strain and when they are under duress from circumstances that threaten the most basic freedoms and liberties that we, as human beings, should expect to enjoy. In Australia, I think the national conversation is even more critical at the moment, so we were really thrilled to be invited to be part of tonight's briefing on the Papua New Guinea National Court inquiry into Australia's Immigration Detention Centre on Manus Island. As I'm sure you're all aware, since late 2012, our government has been sending asylum seekers who arrive in Australia by boat to a detention centre on Manus Island in PNG. This has been a focal point for recent debate about Australia's treatment of asylum seekers, and in particular our policy of offshore processing. Our co-hosts tonight, the Human Rights Law Centre and Amnesty International, have both played a pivotal role drawing national and international attention to the situation on Manus Island. The news from Manus Island, as you all know, came to a tragic climax in February this year with the death of a young Iranian asylum seeker named Reza Barati. The events on 16 and 17 February have been the subject of an independent report by Robert Cornell, which was released yesterday and has of course been covered extensively in the media today. Questions about the lawfulness of Manus Island, taking that conversation a step further, are also at the heart of a PNG National Court proceeding which is currently on foot and which is our subject matter tonight. Amnesty has intervened in the proceedings and is represented and assisted by King & Wood Mallesons and the Human Rights Law Centre. So we're here tonight to talk about what's happening with that inquiry. To lead the discussion, we have Daniel Webb, Director of Legal Advocacy at the Human Rights Law Centre. Daniel recently returned from Papua New Guinea, where he visited the Manus Island Detention Centre as part of the court proceedings. We also have Ben Kiley, a Senior Associate here at King & Wood Mallesons, who is running the legal team assisting Amnesty and the Human Rights Law Centre. Ben leads the Human Rights Law Group in Melbourne and recently acted for the Chief Justice of Nauru in relation to the constitutional crisis that you've probably also heard of. We also have Owen Blackwell, a journalist and former AAP correspondent in PNG. Owen inspected Manus Detention Centre as part of the court's national inquiry, and I know we'll have some interesting stories to share with us tonight. Finally, we have Kate Schutze, Amnesty International's Pacific researcher. Amnesty visited the detention centre on Manus twice and has published reports exposing and condemning the conditions there. This is Breaking People, and this is Still Breaking People, of which Kate was an author, or one of the authors. So the plan for this evening is that I'll spend about 45 minutes asking questions of the panel, and then we'll turn over to the audience for half an hour for more questions and discussions. If there's time, I'll hand back to the panellists for a final word, and then finally I'll be inviting Michael Kingston, Chair of the Board of the Human Rights Law Centre, to make some closing remarks and to thank our speakers. So without further ado, let's proceed. Daniel, first question to you. Can you give us a quick run through on Australia's law and policy in relation to Manus Island? Why are the asylum seekers there?
Sure. Well, look, I think it's no secret that the goal of Australia's asylum seeker policies is to stop the boats, and the government has said that it's going to do that with a single-minded focus on deterrence. So the rationale of our current policies is that people who arrive are treated in a way that's designed to warn off others who are thinking of coming. And to that end, Australian law now says that every single person who arrives in Australia by boat must, as soon as possible, be sent to either Nauru or Manus. The government has said that there are no exceptions to that. So we've seen pregnant women, unaccompanied children, people with significant physical or mental health issues transferred offshore. Manus Island is the facility that adult men are sent to. The first transfers took place in November 2012, and there are currently about 1,200 men detained there. A shocking statistic about Manus Island is that in the 18 months since the first transfers to Manus took place, more people have actually been killed than have been processed and resettled. And I mean, I realise that sounds very dramatic, but it's an inescapable fact. It's a complete misnomer to speak of Manus as a processing and resettlement facility, because quite plainly people haven't been processed and resettled with any efficacy. They've just been left languishing there in huge numbers. And that's really a key concern, and one of the key things we hope to change by being involved in this inquiry is that these people must at some point be processed and resettled and allowed to move on with their lives. You can't just warehouse them. And at the moment they have just been warehoused, and they've been warehoused at extraordinary financial cost to us, and much more importantly at an extraordinary human cost to them.
And do you believe that part of the deterrent effect that you're talking about is intended to encourage people to return home voluntarily, or to return to the countries they've fled?
I do. It's been described as a return-orientated environment. I think Amnesty described it as such, and the United Nations have described it repeatedly as such. And I think, when you have not processed or resettled a single person in 18 months, and when you keep them in the dark as to how long that process is going to take, that is, I think, deliberately designed to corral people into giving up and leaving.
And something I understand at the time of the incidents of 16 and 17 February, at that point no asylum seekers had been processed, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, and I still think, even though there's been some initial determinations made, my understanding is that there's this final stage of refugee processing on Manus that requires the Papua New Guinean Chief Migration Officer to approve a decision. And my understanding is that not one person has been finally determined to be a refugee on Manus in 18 months.
Thank you very much, Daniel. For a sense of what this means, what it means to live on Manus and what it's really like to be there, I'd like to direct the next question to Owen. Now, Owen, as a journalist, has taken some amazing photos of Manus Island, some of which I hope he might be able to show us tonight. You've probably seen some of them already, accompanying much of the media that has been out there about Manus Island. But I mean, in your own words, Owen, what's it like in Manus Island?
I'll actually quote David Cannings, the justice who had the inquiry in Manus. He described it as ramshackle, and I'd have to agree. To get an idea what it's like, in the centre of the centre, in the centre of the facility are two compounds, Foxtrot and Delta, which are built on the skeleton of the Howard era complex. And one of them is a long hangar left over from World War II, it looks like. And in 2011, that was a playroom for kids. And it had pictures. I remember I went there in 2011 and got malaria, and I was there for 3 weeks, and having a look around, it was a playroom for children and all that, but now it sleeps 120 blokes with fans, it's industrial fans to keep the constant PNG, Manus heat out. It's quite dark, and it's like a tunnel, That's it there, actually. That's the one. That used to be a playroom for kids back in 2000. 3.
I'm not sure what I'm seeing.
Yes, it's a dormitory. There's that's Foxtrot compound, so there's 122 blokes sleeping in there. It's quite hot, and in between, randomly spaced between beds, are fans, big industrial fans. Another compound, Delta compound, which that's a picture from Mike compound, I think, where you have asylum seekers sleeping on the ground. We were told by guards, we weren't allowed to interview guards when we went to the centre. It was part of the court order. We just had to stand there and observe, so we had asylum seekers telling us things, and the guards were saying things like, oh, they prefer to sleep on the ground, but we've subsequently found out that during the attack, the beds were taken apart and used as weapons, often in some cases against the asylum seekers. So yeah, it's not a nice place. This is Delta compound here. The photo looks a lot better than I remember it. It's quite dirty. A lot of the toilets were destroyed. This is quite a dark area. It was raining, starting to rain at the time, and again it's quite hot. There's a few men who were injured in there actually, who were talking about the attack, but again I couldn't ask them any questions. They just take notes. They're bullet holes from the night of the attack.
Whereabouts are they?
That's in a random container just near one of the gates, where I think, though I can't say for 100% certainly, where the police, or where the attack came in over the fence.
So is this a life-size container?
Yeah, it's quite a large container. We weren't told what was in it. It's just near the gate, and there are 2 bullet holes in it. Yeah. It's the sign that the guards are asked to carry because asylum seekers attempt suicide so much that they have to carry knives to cut them down.
What's that off the knife?
It's a hooked, serrated knife. Apparently the Irish police carry them as well, as a matter of course. So it's a tidbit. Yeah, and you'll see this green mesh. They have this green mesh everywhere. One of the things that struck me the most being there, the prison, there's a little police prison on Manus Island where they, at the time, had 2 prisoners. One was a man in there for robbery, a man and a woman both in for robbery. The woman had stolen a packet of noodles. Her family could come and visit her and give her food. And twice a day they let the woman out into the beach to swim and go to the toilet because they have no toilets in the prison. At the Manus Island Detention Centre, they block the ocean view from the detainees, which I think is a particularly harsh measure, given that. Oh, and that's in Bravo compound. I beg your pardon, excuse me, that's Oscar compound. That's the bedrooms in Oscar compound, where they're huge, big white marquees. A lot of people packed in them, 42 beds in one.
It's a testament, though, that this does not look as packed as the previous dormitory that we saw in the first.
No, there's a definite difference between Oscar and my compounds compared to Foxtrot and Delta. There's a very difference. It's very different.
Is the one where the sick people, the patients were? Not
no,
in Oscar,
it was next to
across?
it. That was next. And that's Delta. That's just outside Delta.
Back to the start. Wow. Some quite moving and thought-provoking images. Thank you. Now, Kate, I heard you kind of getting ready to say something, so I'll direct the next question to you. What are Amnesty's main concerns about the conditions, and what are some of the things that you'd like to highlight about the state of living in the detention centre at Manus?
We've had 2 trips now, so I guess one of the shocking things on returning there is that the mental health situation is quite clearly deteriorated, and there is now a specialised area for psychiatric patients, as it was described to us, and there are at least 4 people under constant watch in that area. There is no full-time psychiatrist on Manus to this date, even though the Minister advised differently to us. As part of the court proceedings, the medical evidence there was that there is a visiting psychiatrist, and they couldn't tell us how often or how frequently these psychiatrists return to make assessments, so that's really alarming. I think the overcrowding and the sense of sort of despair and frustration following violence, people are clearly distressed and traumatised by that. And the lack of information, the uncertainty, they're just left in limbo. They're given no meaningful activities to do throughout the day. I remember asking a TSA officer why they take games in for 1 hour each day into the compounds, and they said oh, well, we couldn't leave them with them the whole time because then they'd be irresponsible and wouldn't share it properly. And I just kind of went, really? You know, you're talking about packs of cards to keep people entertained throughout the day. How is that presenting any kind of a security risk or a threat or whatever? But they still had this rationale behind denying people things. Really basic stuff. So clothes, shoes, MP3 players are used as reward and punishment. So good people might be able to access certain items that they had in their personal belongings, like MP3 players. There is apparently a shipping container full of shoes, but that's a special request. So only certain people get access to shoes, and you would have seen in some of the photos that the majority of people are just given thongs or flip-flops, to wear in conditions where there's a hard rock ground and torrential downpour quite frequently because of the tropical climate.
I mean, and it is extremely hot in PNG. I've never been there myself, but and I know Owen mentioned that he caught malaria after the first time he went to Manus Island. Is disease and illness a concern as well?
I think it's likely to be a growing problem, particularly because of the overcrowding. To date, it has been managed to an extent. They do have access to anti-malarial tablets, but some people are saying that they didn't want to take them because of the side effects. One of the things we noticed on the first visit, as you go into the compound, there's a World Health Organisation notice about prevention of malaria. It says wear long-sleeve shirts and pants, have mosquito nets, use mosquito repellent, take the tablets, and spray frequently in the areas. They do occasionally spray around the site to stop mosquitoes breeding, and they're given tablets. So they're doing 2 of the 6 options to sort of prevent that. There was an outbreak of gastro just before we went the first time in November. Those things have a tendency to spread. But the biggest risk to their health is the fact that they were attacked. They were physically and violently attacked.
So let's turn to that. What can you tell us about the events leading up to the death of Reza Barati?
So from the evidence that we've been able to gather, which is largely consistent with the Cornell report, although the findings were very different, there were protests happening for a number of days. They were relatively peaceful protests. There are some allegations that asylum seekers may have thrown rocks, but there's also allegations that that was because locals outside the fence were throwing rocks at them first, and they were throwing those rocks back. We've also received a few reports that the compounds were actually cleared of any projectiles such as rocks before any of this happened, which seems extraordinary. Tensions at the centre were escalating over a period of time, and it seems that those reports and concerns were ignored. And the biggest concern for asylum seekers, and the reason why they were protesting, is because they had no information about when they'd be released, when their claims would be processed. So that was the main issue they were raising with the authorities. When they didn't get a response, they continued their protests. The response was to push back with some violence. On the first night, there were a number of asylum seekers who went outside the external gates to the compound, but they were very quickly rounded up and pushed back. Some of the G4S testimony says that expat guards had to stand between the locals and the asylum seekers to stop them attacking on that evening. They managed to calm that down. And then, of course, as soon as the night shift changed over on the second day, that's when we saw the majority of the violence. And some of the reports we have is that 350 of the 400 people in Mike compound were beaten up because that was where they broke in and pushed through.
One of the things that I felt reading the Cornell report, as I briefly did earlier today, was that it seems as though there's at least an implicit assumption that the cause of the violence was the actions of the asylum seekers. Were there other factors as well?
I don't think, even if the protests did get out of hand by some people, it does warrant the disproportionate response. So I think it's inaccurate and unfair to say that started it. Certainly it added to the tensions on both sides. Sorry, what was the...
I was trying to get it, but there been tensions on both sides.
Yeah, so, and that's fueled by the policies in place and the way the centre's run. There's very little community engagement with nationals. They're not told anything from the PNG government about resettlement plans. They don't know what's likely to happen. They're kept in the dark as much as asylum seekers. So when tension starts to build, there's fear and anxiety on both sides. And the reality is that, I love the country and I've worked there quite a bit, but Papua New Guinea is a violent place. It is not uncommon to have the police involved in very serious human rights abuses. This whole thing, they actually shot at a crowd, at people level, not into the air, with high-powered weapons, and that's just not an appropriate method of crowd control. And the main frustration here is that there's been an outright refusal of either government to take responsibility or follow through with any charges from those events.
And in fact, we've seen the bullet holes tonight. Daniel, what were your impressions? And what are your impressions of what was happening and of the asylum seekers in Manus Island? Because you have been there as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I went there with my eyes wide open. I'd read Amnesty's previous report. I'd read, I think, everything that had been written about conditions inside the detention centre. But I was still completely shocked and confronted to see just how bad conditions were. I mean, that old World War II hangar with 120 beds crammed in so close together you can't walk between them. It's chronically overcrowded. The security presence is pretty overwhelming, and that gives the place a very hostile, prison-like atmosphere. And I mean, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. The other point is that we weren't allowed to talk to asylum seekers, but everywhere we went around the place, we were just swamped by people who were obviously desperate for someone to help them and for someone to listen to their story. The United Nations Refugee Agency has inspected places of detention and refugee camps all over the world, and in every one of their reports on Manus Island, they've described the conditions as inhumane and as falling short of international standards. And I think, that about sums it up.
I'm struck by your comment that you weren't allowed to speak with the detainees. Have they had access to other lawyers or to other forms of assistance?
They've had much less access than they should. The PNG public solicitor was appointed to represent them in the National Court inquiry.
The public solicitor's office is like legal aid.
Exactly, yeah. And they've also spoken to one or two other lawyers, but access is a key challenge. I mean, in that 18 months that people have been locked up there, prior to the court initiating this inquiry itself, not one asylum seeker on Manus brought any sort of legal proceeding in the Papua New Guinean courts, despite PNG having very extensive human rights protections. Now, the reason no one took a case to the courts is not because, they're all satisfied with the way that they're being treated. It's because they lacked access to anyone who could advise them of their rights and who could help them prosecute alleged violations. And I think that isolation from legal assistance is absolutely by design. I mean, there's a lot of places Australia could detain asylum seekers, but we've chosen to detain them in an incredibly remote part of another country. And part of the purpose of that is to take them beyond the reach of the protections that are offered by access to lawyers and access to the courts, which is the great thing about this inquiry, is that it then takes the rule of law to those asylum seekers.
So that is an excellent segue into my next question, which is about the National Court inquiry. And I might hand to Ben this time. Can you give us some background on the inquiry and what the legal basis for it is?
Sure. I've said it before, but the PNG National Constitution is in many respects a human rights lawyer's dream. In addition to containing a whole raft of human rights protections that we simply yearn for in Australia, it has a rather remarkable mechanism where people who feel their rights have been aggrieved can obviously bring individual suits to challenge those conditions or those breaches and seek redress. In addition to that, any organisation that has an interest in human rights is able to bring a case of its own motion without the need to have an individual plaintiff, such as we have that requirement in Australia. And then thirdly, and perhaps most extraordinarily to an Australian lawyer at least, is that any judge of the National Court of PNG or the Supreme Court can of their own motion create their own proceeding if they suspect there is a potential violation of human rights going on in PNG. And in response to the conditions and the circumstances that led to the riots and the deaths, one of the judges who was stationed in that area decided that it was time that someone took a serious look at what was going on, using the full powers of the court and the full resources that he had at his disposal to commence the inquiry. And so in some respects it was a hybrid of a normal proceeding where there was evidence being collected, barristers, witnesses, but it was also had inquisitorial elements that you normally see in other jurisdictions that aren't familiar to those of us that practice in Australia. So a remarkable right and power, and I think Daniel touches on why in a place like PNG something like that is so important, because there isn't the access to lawyers, or at least, and we found this when we tried to run the proceedings, not the culture within the legal profession in PNG, at least to the same extent we have in Australia, of pro bono assistance of human rights lawyers being active and being vocal about abuses that are going on. And they've got a lot of challenges in PNG, so you can see that the people that are involved and interested in this legal area have got a lot on their plate, in addition to the conditions at Manus.
And so what are some of the legal arguments that you're making?
Well, I need to be a bit careful about that because I'm not convinced that everyone here is a friend, so I won't reveal any state secrets. But in broad terms, I think there are three key things that the judge himself has flagged that he'd like to look at, and areas that we certainly have been pursuing as part of our involvement in this inquiry. And they are broadly, first off, the legality of the detention under the Migration Act. For those of you that have ever practiced in Pacific jurisdictions, you'll appreciate that there isn't quite the attention to legislative drafting that we pride ourselves on here in Australia, much to many law students' pain. So there are certain issues with the Migration Act and the extent to which it authorises what's going on in Manus. That's, I think, one very important area that needs to be assessed, looked at and determined. And then, in addition to that, I think the second area of focus is assuming that the Migration Act does allow what's going on in Manus to keep going on. Is that constitutional? And I mentioned that the PNG constitution, unlike our Australian one, where we have to scramble around to try and find a right here and there and imply one, if we're lucky, there are an extensive array of human rights protected by the PNG constitution, many of which are quite obviously engaged by what's going on in Manus. The most obvious is the right to liberty. And the fact that there's a clear right to liberty enshrined in the PNG constitution that is subject to a number of very specific and limited exceptions. And I think we'll touch on this perhaps later on, but there is a question of whether the Migration Act, assuming it does authorise the detention, is then itself consistent with the restrictions and obligations that are imposed on the government and the state of PNG by the constitution, the rights that it protects. That's the second category. The third category is the actual conditions themselves. And as I've mentioned, there are a range of protections in the constitution that specify minimum humane standards of treatment that must be adhered to for those that are in detention, and also by the state and its actors more generally. So there is a real question, I think, from the photos, from the commentary we've heard from the people that are on the panel, about the extent to which the actual conditions themselves, separate to the legality of the detention, are actually also potentially in violation of the PNG constitution and the rights that it protects.
Very serious matters raised there. Where's the case up to at the moment?
One of those matters that happens, I think, all too frequently in law, where it was massively urgent for the first 3 weeks, because the judge had decided, quite uniquely, it turns out in the PNG judiciary, to try and run a case quickly. And he decided that he wanted to have the whole matter heard and determined in 3 weeks. So I get a call from Daniel, I think it was on a Wednesday afternoon, suggesting that this was going on, and we needed 1 to find PNG lawyers, 2 to get a team ready to go, and then 3, maybe find barristers if we're lucky. And of course, ones that are admitted in PNG, because it's PNG law, and you probably need some advice on those particularly unique elements that we don't have in Australia. So it was a case of woe to go potentially in 3 weeks. So it was a massive undertaking. It was, I think, 2 or 3 all-nighters from a couple of members of the team, and of course, given the important issues, they were glad to do it. So it was all go. It was all very, it looked like it was going to be done very quickly, and that's because the judge decided that the issues that related to detention at Manus were serious, and they needed to be dealt with quickly, so that if he was going to make orders, which would be binding on the state and on the people that are acting at Manus to improve conditions, or potentially to look at the validity of the detention, it was important, probably critical, that those improvements or changes be implemented as soon as possible. So that was the reason for the 3-week time frame. Then the PNG government, in league and indefinitely supported by the Australian government, decided that they needed to do whatever they could to shut this inquiry down, because there was a real risk that someone was actually going to do something about what was happening up there. So they made an application for the judge to recuse himself on the basis of apprehended bias. Judge Canning, this is the judge who'd commenced and was hearing the inquiry on the basis of apprehended bias. And for those of you, I suppose, fortunate enough not to have gone to law school in the audience, basically that's a reflection of the fundamental principle in the legal systems around the world. The judges have to be both impartial and also be seen to be impartial. And if you're not, and if a reasonable person would perceive you not to be, then you should step down from the case and hand it to another person. And the state had argued that because Justice Cannings, by virtue of commencing the inquiry and then basically hearing it, there was a suggestion or an implication that he'd already decided there were issues that needed to be fixed. But of course, when you've got a unique power like the PNG Constitution for judges to commence inquiries on their own initiative, it must be that they suspect something's going on. Otherwise you wouldn't have started the inquiry in the first place. So the test has to be different. Anyway, Justice Cannings, I think rather sensibly, there are a couple other grounds, but I won't go into them. Justice Cannings very sensibly rejected that application. Then that was all we'd heard about, and we thought, oh great, let's keep rushing ahead to judgment. And then we find out, I think on Friday afternoon, before everyone's meant to adjourn to go back to Port Moresby, that the state's filed an urgent interlocutory injunction and sort of stay in the Supreme Court, which is the next level court up, seeking judicial review of Judge Canning's refusal to recuse himself. And I think this is where you get a sense that Judge Cannings is perhaps unique for a variety of reasons in the PNG judiciary, that I won't go into all of them here, but we still haven't got a judgment on that application yet. So, and until the Supreme Court rules, it's been adjourned many multiple times, until they actually decide on whether this inquiry, whether the judge should, it's not even at the stage where they decide on the question of whether the judge should have recused himself. It's whether the state has leave to appeal from the judge's decision to recuse himself. So we're not even at the final stage yet. So you can see they're sort of throwing everything they can, hoping they can drag things out as long as possible, so that whatever can happen, won't be fixed. It's just amazing. And that was done with full support and encouragement by the Australian government, and that was let out. The cat was let out of the bag, if you like, by the PNG foreign minister, who confirmed that the PNG government was doing this and was fully supported by the Australian government, despite the fact that the Australian government was doing all it could to distance itself from this inquiry and from the actions the PNG government was taking to shut it down. So I think the cat is well and truly out of the bag.
So just to summarise where it's up to, it has been heard. That was a 3-week hearing that went ahead. When was that?
That was in March.
In March, and now matters are essentially in limbo until a series of complex legal questions are resolved, if they are ever
Well, I don't think they're that complex. I think the state wants them to make them that complex, but they do need to be resolved. And the other members of the judiciary in PNG, consistent with my other experience with the Pacific Islands, aren't in a great rush to get things moving, unlike Justice Canning's. So we are unsure where things are at in that respect. Pacific time, indeed.
I'm curious to hear more about what happened during those 3 weeks of the hearings and exactly what went down. And I understand, Owen, that you were there as a journalist watching much of the proceedings.
Yep.
What can you tell us about what you heard and saw during those 3 weeks?
I think there was all up about 16 or 17 asylum seekers ended up giving testimony, and well, they first of all they couldn't speak specifically about the riot. They could only talk about generally the centre, and all of them spoke about a sense of fear. I remember there was only one man who said he didn't mind conditions so much, and I got the sense off him he was just trying to be nice and not cause a fuss. But I mean, really, everyone said everything that's been said in this panel. We're not getting information. We don't know what's coming next. We don't know why we're here. We're not let out of the camp. When the camp was set up initially, there were all these promises made about interacting with the people of Manus, who are lovely, by the way. It's actually a really nice place, and that hasn't happened. So there's a real sense of confusion and desperation, even in the courthouse. They were just, what's going on? Thanks for hearing us. That was something everyone expressed to the judge. Thank you so much for letting us talk.
Were the asylum seekers assisted during the proceedings?
There were some translators and stuff, and people to get them to the court, but I don't know if any other special assistance.
Okay. And I guess a question for everyone on the panel. I mean, what was it that you took away from the proceedings? I understand you were all there or very much involved in some way or another.
I mean,
what evidence would you like to highlight that came out?
Yeah, sure. Look, well, Kate and I got there very late because the chief migration officer, who, as it happens, was a respondent in the proceeding, needed to personally approve our application for a visa, and lo and behold, he didn't seem to be in any great hurry to do that. But we got there, and when we did, one thing that I remember really clearly and that I'll never forget is that one of the asylum seekers, after giving his evidence, said, "I just want to say something. Your Honour, thank you for commencing this inquiry. Coming to the court today and telling you my story is the first time I've felt human since I was sent here." And I think that captured the mood pretty well.
Kate, any particular recollections you'd like to share?
Well, I suppose in many respects I was fortunate in that I got to stay in Melbourne in comparative luxury while these guys were doing battle both to get into PNG and then once they were there to be heard and be participating in the proceeding. But I think for me, what I took out of the proceeding, and it's still going, so it's not a full lesson yet, is I think Daniel's point about we have done as a country a great deal to put these people out of the reach of our justice system, of the rights and the scrutiny that comes with detaining people in Australia. We have gone out of our way to essentially copy the model that the Americans have perfected at Guantanamo Bay by putting these people out of sight, out of mind, out of reach of our legal system. And what this proceeding in this case highlights is the need, when that happens, to have effective means and mechanisms for bringing action in the place where they are detained. Because that is, by far and away the most practical way of affecting improvements in the conditions in which people are being held, and also to question the legality of the actual detention itself. So I think I think it's taking the rule of law to these people, where so much effort has been invested in trying to move them outside of the reach of the rule of law.
For me, I think one of the things to take away from this court case is that, these constitutional powers and these rights are things that need to be defended, not just for asylum seekers, but for every single person who is living in PNG right now and might visit the country, because they're critical to ensuring that rights are protected and respected in country where there's no other mechanism for that. But the other thing that stood out for me, I guess, is the ability of all of us here to mobilise on such short notice with the court inquiry, to collaborate together. The assistance that KWM's provided and the Human Rights Law Centre has just been extraordinary, and it was a bit of a rollercoaster ride for a few weeks there. But you know, it is a significant issue, and if we keep challenging these cases and raising these issues, then we will eventually get somewhere. I think that's really important.
Kate, while I've got you, what is Amnesty hoping to achieve here?
Well, I mean, our end goal is to end offshore processing, and I think the reality with Manus Island is that Australia cannot guarantee the safety and protection of asylum seekers there. So with Manus Island particularly, I think there's an urgent need to shut down the centre, because we don't have the capacity, the resources, and neither does the PNG government to guarantee their safety, and that's got to be a critical element of any refugee policy if you want to not breach the principle of refoulement, which is sending people back home or to another country where their life or liberty is at risk. That is exactly what we're doing now, and that's highly problematic. In terms of the court case, you know, I think it's really important that this is the first court case to open up and to let those asylum seekers know that people in the outside world do care, they are watching, and they are challenging what's happening with the PNG and the Australian government. And I think to them, you know, their testimony in court showed how much that meant to them and how significant that was.
And Daniel, from the Human Rights Law Centre's point of view, what do you think the impact has been so far?
I think first of all, thanks, Ben. First of all, the inquiry has generated some much needed transparency about just what it's like inside. I mean, for the first time, a journalist got to go inside and take a picture and publish it. That hasn't happened before in the 18 months that we've been sending people there. And it absolutely should not have taken an order from the national court of another country for an Australian journalist to go inside and take a photo of this Australian-run facility and show the Australian people just what our policies look like on the ground. But that happened, and it only happened because of this inquiry. So that's one positive impact. The second is, I think it's generated some pressure to actually process and resettle people. I mean, people have been receiving some assistance from migration officers to prepare their refugee claims, but processing certainly hasn't been happening with any speed or urgency. And like I said, no one's been finally determined or processed. And a case like this just generates that extra pressure to do something other than deprive these people of their liberty, to actually develop some sort of clear plan as to what you're going to do to allow them to eventually move on with their lives, and then to go about implementing that plan. And the third benefit is that Amnesty and us have been able to develop a little bit of a legal presence there now. I mean, we've met the organisations and the local lawyers on the ground, and we're now better positioned to run these kinds of cases in the future. And that's going to be very important. I mean, refugee processing and detention in Australia has produced litigation on lots of different issues. All of those issues are at play now in PNG, but there's just not the legal community there to run those cases. So it's important to react and to develop a legal presence in the places that Australia now sends people to. And this case has helped us do that. And just maybe to give you an example of the kind of way that might be important, I mean, say tomorrow 200 asylum seekers are told their claims have been rejected and they're going to be removed from the country. Now, not all of those, I mean, some of those rejections might be wrong. Some of them may be infected by mistakes. But who's going to help those asylum seekers take their appeals to the PNG courts? And the answer is, I don't think there's anyone. And so it's vital that you sort of have your hooks in and you've got that presence so that you can be notified of those decisions and you can do something about them.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I mean, looking to the future, and I am mindful of the time, so I'll wrap up the final few questions relatively quickly. I mean, I guess a question for all of you, and that is, what steps should the government be taking to improve human rights protections in refugee processing centres, including Manus? Kate, I know you said that Amnesty's position is that they should be shut down and we need to end offshore processing. Given the government's seemingly ironclad commitment to offshore processing, what steps can be taken to improve conditions in those places?
Well, our report, This is Breaking People, last year made a number of recommendations in the interim which could be done by both the Australian and the Papua New Guinea governments to improve conditions at the centre, to speed up plans to process and to resettle refugees there, because at the moment, like I said earlier, it is a return-oriented environment. And there's no real plans in place to process or resettle these people. So if you want to call it a processing centre, then start processing them and do it right, do it when they've got legal protections in place, when they're able to access lawyers and they can let that process run its course. If it's fair to asylum seekers, then that in fact strengthens, our position internally and externally in terms of respecting the rule of law and the justice system.
Do you believe that asylum seekers on Manus Island will in fact be resettled in PNG?
I think the reality is very few people will be resettled there, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I think the majority of people don't want to be resettled in Papua New Guinea, and you have to bear in mind that some people are coming from countries where, even though they are persecuted, the living standard is much better generally than what it is in Papua New Guinea. What a lot of people don't know is that Papua New Guinea has rates of violence against women which is comparable to the Congo. Maternal deaths are extraordinarily high, and under 5 infant mortality is extraordinarily high. So, in terms of resettlement options, for some people that's not offering them any kind of life or any kind of security. So some of those people will unfortunately opt to return home and be with their families, even if there's a serious risk to their lives. And that's very unfortunate. The reality is that Papua New Guinea has a very limited capacity to integrate people from different ethnicities, and I think if you have any experience working in the Pacific, Papua New Guinea is very diverse. There are thousands of language groups within the country. Transport across the country is quite challenging, so it would be up to the local community as to whether they accept it and embrace you. And the reality is that an outsider is unlikely to ever have real prospects of owning their own land, owning their own property in PNG, because 97% of land is communally owned. And I think that's going to be the trigger point for local people to get upset about resettlement plans, is they will see that as people taking away their land.
And what about people of diverse sexuality or gender identity?
For LGBTI people, homosexuality is still criminalised in Papua New Guinea. It carries quite harsh penalties. It is a largely Christian nation which has very little tolerance of people who are gay, transgender or bisexual. Amnesty International has personally received reports, some in the last 12 months, of sex workers being attacked, killed, subject to horrific treatment, sometimes at the hands of police. Gay people are sometimes raped by the police, forced to swallow condoms, really horrible kind of behaviour and treatment. And my understanding is, even though it's very hard to find a reported case where someone's been charged under the homosexuality laws, the reality is the majority of cases in PNG are not recorded, but they are happening. And I was hearing last week that there are people in Bomana prison in Port Moresby who have been convicted of homosexuality.
Thank you very much. Daniel, I might just hand over to you briefly. So despite all of these things that we know, despite the imagery that we've seen and the evidence that has been brought before the Australian government, including in the Cornell report released yesterday, they still seem committed to pursuing offshore processing and continuing to run the Manus Island Detention Centre at considerable cost. How do you see this debate progressing in the coming months? Where to next in the public debate?
Where to next? I mean, look, there are lots of problems with the way that this asylum seeker debate plays out in public, particularly around the use of language. I mean, you've got politicians from both the Labor Party and the Coalition saying that most asylum seekers are economic migrants, when in fact their own departments of immigration have told them consistently over the last decade that more than 90% of people who arrive on boats are refugees who genuinely need protection. So language is a big issue. The language of our politicians ought to inform us. Instead, I think our understanding of the issue is often poorer for the things that they've said. But more fundamentally, the biggest issue I see with the way that this debate plays out at the moment is that boat arrivals are portrayed as the problem, and they're not the problem, they're a symptom of the problem. The underlying problem is that there are people in our region who need protection and who can't access it without getting on a boat. And deaths at sea and boats arriving, they're a symptom of that underlying problem. So I think properly understood, each and every time a boat arrives and each and every time a person drowns in the middle of the ocean, it shows that we've failed, but not that we've failed to frighten them away by having scary enough policies. It shows that we've failed as a region to develop a system that ensures that people who need protection can access it without having to risk their lives on boats. So I think the next step in the public debate, I hope, is to better understand the real nature of the problem. And I think people are increasingly realising that. I mean, we've seen just this week in the Fairfax papers reports of asylum seekers planning to board boats to New Zealand. We've seen reports of asylum seekers being intercepted off Sri Lanka, reportedly headed to New Zealand. And we hear reports of our Navy continuing to intercept boats on the high seas and turn them back to Indonesia. So I think people will gradually, hopefully sooner rather than later, realise that stopping the boats doesn't solve the underlying problem.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Now, on that note about public debate, I think it might be timely to hand over to our audience to ask some questions. I know that you will all have many interesting things to ask and comments to make. I do ask that you keep comments brief, but more than welcome to share your views.
Sorry, I just want some clarification. Did I understand it right that asylum seekers can challenge a negative assessment in PNG? Because my understanding is that the Australian government said that they can never, I'm not a lawyer, that they can never challenge any more negative assessment. And somehow, somewhere, I heard that you said that in PNG they can.
Yeah.
So could you clarify that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, there is, my understanding of the processing arrangements in PNG is that an initial determination is made, and if that determination is negative, it's reviewed, and it's going to be reviewed by some sort of panel that I don't yet think has been established, but in any event, there's plans to have a process by which these decisions can be internally reviewed. But these are decisions made under PNG law, and as is the case in Australia, decisions made under law can generally be challenged on legal grounds in superior courts. And I mean, even in the Australian Migration Act, there was an attempt to exclude superior courts from being able to review these decisions, and over time that's failed. The superior courts have reviewed decisions by the Refugee Review Tribunal and checked them for legal errors and things like that. And absolutely the courts of PNG will and should play that same supervisory role.
I think, just to add to that, I think that highlights the great importance and indeed urgency of ensuring that there is adequate legal representation and assistance available to these people to make their way through this very complex and novel process for PNG.
Gentleman in the middle here.
Julia Burnside said yesterday, and I think many people would agree, that even though the Australian government tries to keep distant and say it's all Nauru's or PNG's problem, everything that's happening there is actually caused by and paid for by the Australian government. And my question is, what's the present state of litigation in Australia about Australia's obligations, and might that play a role, a synergistic role with litigation in PNG? Because if our court made a declaration or order about whether or not Australia was complying, and the money stream dried up or whatever, I mean, I could just see opportunities for synergy.
Thanks. Look, no, I think it's. I think it's a great question, and it highlights the absolute sort of urgency and importance of a multi-faceted approach to this problem, because you're not going to fix it in PNG, and you're not going to fix it just here necessarily. And no, certainly there are a number of cases and proceedings that are either on foot or being planned to look at these issues, and ultimately it will come down to this question, I think, in many cases of effective control, and proving that the things that you said are true, and I think that they are obviously true. And you need to be, in many respects, naive, foolish or willfully blind to think that Australia doesn't have effective control over what's going on in Manus. If you wanted to shut it down, if you wanted to change the conditions there, we could do it in a heartbeat, because if you control the purse, you can control what's happening. So I think that is what needs to be explored here in Australia. There are a number of difficulties, which I won't go into necessarily in complete detail, with bringing cases here in Australia in relation to those issues. So it is by no means, I suppose, as good a mechanism as you would like, but certainly coupled with an active PNG strategy, I think it's a very important way forward.
Just to add something to that, one of the comments that was made to us is that the PNG government is treating Manus Island like it's an external territory run by Australia, and from our observations of control at that facility, and the very limited presence of any PNG immigration officials, was very much that Australia is in control, and that's an issue not just for PNG, because ultimately they still have liability under international conventions that they've signed up to, and of course their domestic laws in the Constitution. So I think the approach has to be to challenge that consistently on both angles, because they can't just avoid that liability and say Australia's controlling it, they're funding it, they're doing whatever they want with the centre, and we don't really care what's going on there, because the reality is the responsibility lies with PNG as much as it does Australia.
And just picking up on the point about the obligations that PNG has under its constitution, I understand there have been some reports that PNG has or might amend its constitution to exclude asylum seekers from those protections. Is that right?
Thanks. I suppose that's one of the difficulties of litigating against a state, is that they can change the rules. And they certainly have done this to an extent in this case. One of the things I touched on earlier was that the right to liberty is quite robust and has a limited number of exceptions in the PNG constitution, one of which is the detention of people for the purposes of removing them if they are unlawfully in PNG. Now, and originally the PNG government purported to rely on that power as the constitutional basis for having the Manus Island Processing Centre. But of course, the people that were there in Manus weren't in PNG illegally. They'd all been given valid entry visas for the purpose of them being sent there by Australia. So the question of whether that constitutional power allowed their detention was a very real one that needed to be investigated. Of course, before the Canning's process could be fully underway, the PNG government amended the constitution to try and fix that problem. Whether that's effective is something that I think will be tested during the proceedings, if and when they eventually recommence.
Yeah, they flagged that. The PNG government had flagged that it was going to change its constitution, I think, back in just after November 2012 when the centre opened, because they knew it's the most obvious challenge to anybody's detention in PNG is that you can't be locked up unless you've committed a crime. So, but in true Melanesian time, it's taken them a long time to get around to it, but they had flagged it very early on.
Can I just add, I think that amendment to the Constitution says two other things. One is it shows just how far the cart has been put before the horse, that people have been locked up there for over a year, and then they get around to amending the Constitution to try and make it lawful. People have been sent there, the deterrence message has been spruiked, and now they're trying to figure out the details. And the second thing that it says is, I mean, Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights, yet one of our former colonies was bold enough to include these very extensive human rights protections in their own constitution. And our domestic policy has provided the impetus for them to whittle away those human rights protections. We're not just talking about the right to liberty. There's now, the PNG government recently has filed a challenge in the Supreme Court to this inquiry function, the function that the court used to launch the Manus inquiry. Now that inquiry function is vital to human rights protections in PNG. It's been used by the court to investigate conditions in a prison where there'd been a large number of unexplained deaths in custody. It's been used to investigate allegations of serious police brutality. In the future, maybe it'll be used to investigate, sorcery-related violence or other significant human rights issues in PNG. And it's vital because in PNG, not every human rights victim can get to the court and complain about their human rights being breached. Sometimes the court's got to go to them. So if this inquiry function is whittled away, it's a bad thing for asylum seekers, but it's also a bad thing for any potential human rights victim in PNG. And I think it's really an indictment on Australia that our domestic policies are threatening these important human rights protections in a country that needs them.
Sorry. I'm not a lawyer, but Papua New Guinea's legal system is, from the outside at least, quite robust. I mean, the fact that this challenge was made, that challenge was always going to happen. You can't, like commented by someone earlier, you can't hand out a parking ticket in Papua New Guinea without somebody challenging it and it becoming a long-running dispute involving stays and injunctions. And so I'm with this challenge to Canning's inquiry, I mean, I went in there to that case on the Monday and I was like, I wonder if it'll make it to Wednesday. You know, man, I was there for a leadership dispute. I went over there as a foreign correspondent. I was a court correspondent for a good solid year and a half. Like, it was just, everything takes an extremely long time in that country, and I think a lot of the lawyers use it by design. You know, you appeal and just then wait 6 months until something, you know. Anyway.
I think we'll take another question from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Does anybody, we're seeing some cracks beginning in Papua New Guinea in politics. Does anybody have a reading on the political landscape to say this is, if they got in a little bit deeper than they thought they wouldn't, if there's any fragmentation likely within the opposition, to actually say this, we've been off more than we can chew here. Maybe is there going to be any kind of reaction and stop being Australia's patsy?
No, I think at the moment the current government is quite strong. It's had its usual. I mean, they've just recently lost the treasurer and all that. But no, I don't think. No, I don't see that in the immediate future for PNG's politics. And also the opposition is quite weak. There's only about 4 or 5 members in the PNG opposition to 100 and something in the government. But the opposition has its own case, its own challenge to Manus. That's been going on and off since 2012. It's stopped and started. I've been desperately trying to find out today exactly where that case is at, but I've been unable to. So, yeah.
And the PNG opposition leader actually tried to join the Canning's inquiry process at the same time that that Amnesty did. So they're obviously trying to pursue the action still.
I would say there are some pressure points. There is the opposition challenge, so not everyone is on board with this. I think any government in PNG is going to be wary of interfering with land rights. So if they feel like the landowners on Manus are getting upset, or the places where they plan to resettle people, they will not touch that. The other thing is they are susceptible to international pressure in a way that some other countries aren't. Every time we've raised a massive human rights issue in the last 2 years, there has been a very prompt response and an investigation by the police into that. So they have been reactive where there is that international pressure. At times it has involved the Prime Minister responding to incidents happening across the country and saying they'll do more to stop the violence or to address those concerns. The problem where it's lacking is the implementation, I guess. But the reality is that Papua New Guinea and Nauru are receiving extraordinary amounts of money to take on asylum seekers, and while that continues to happen, it is going to be challenging for them to push back. But other countries in the Pacific have said, absolutely, we don't want this happening with us because we have our own issues to deal with. So I think there is potential there, but the reality is that the incentive for them to keep asylum seekers there is too great at the moment.
And the incentive to continue towing the line, even if it conflicts with their own laws. Thanks. Maybe we'll go to the young man 3 rows from back.
Hi, my name's Josh. I'm a journalism student at ETS. My question is, just from my reading of this issue, from my perspective, I guess, maybe a little bit pragmatic, it seems like the way forward for this, as a broader issue of stopping offshore detention and offshore processing, is going to be educating people of the general public to take the view that it's not right, because while it's a popular thing for the government, for the Australian government to have harsh policies towards asylum seekers, they're going to just continue down that path. Because like the last election was kind of the first one where it was like a bidding war between who could be the harshest. That was how I understood it. So what could you suggest, I guess, or practical solutions for people, advocates or otherwise, to influence just the general public and the general perception, to humanise this debate and try and move forward?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's a really good point, because the fact remains that as atrocious as these policies are, they are supported by a very large number of Australians.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a challenging one, and I think change needs to happen at a variety of levels, influencing public opinion and the language we use around this issue. When we talk about asylum seekers, we tend to use negative words like boat people, and they have a whole range of implications that come with it about us assuming that they've come here illegally from the start, so they've done something wrong, therefore they should be punished, which kind of legitimises almost in a way the way they're being treated by this government. But I also think leadership needs to come from the top, and we need to find ways to chip it away at a few different levels. So one of them is that social change and that public perception. One of them is challenging through legal proceedings and court cases and enforcing the rights of those individuals concerned. The other thing is working with politicians and media to change what we're actually talking about here. I mean, you heard Daniel say earlier, we're not actually talking about the real issue if we say we want to stop the boats. I mean, we're not changing anything in the region in terms of the flow of refugees. And same with these plans to resettle in Nauru, PNG and Cambodia now. All we're doing is forcing these people to resettle in countries where they will face further risks. They're likely to flee again and take an alternate route, possibly a more risky one, die on the way, or go back to situations where it is particularly volatile for them. And one of the extraordinary things that I think is not getting enough attention is there are 5 Syrians on Manus Island right now. Why are their claims not being expedited when the UN has said that their claims should be accepted as a matter of course? There is no reason to lock up and detain those people on Manus Island. They're clearly genuine refugees, and we need to keep asking those questions of government, of leaders, and in that public forum.
Well, as a journalist, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that question as well.
I'm sorry, what was the question? It was
how to change the debate.
How to change the debate. Oh man, I've been slamming my head against the wall on this one. I don't know. Education. Send people to Papua New Guinea and say, there, have a look. That's what people are living in now. Shut up. I wish I had a more mature answer to that question. I don't really. Just keep telling people what it's like, and hopefully they'll listen.
So one of the things we talked about earlier was the access that lawyers have had to the detention centre and to detainees. What kind of access has the media had?
Yeah, we none. Up until the Canning's inquiry, we had no access. I went there in 2011 when it was the skeleton of the Howard era centre, and then after that, once it was being set up, I requested many times with the PNG government, because over in PNG, Australia's very, very, very large DFAT presence would be like, no, it's all up to Papua New Guinea, they decide, yeah, we have nothing to say over it. So I go there, and on more than one occasion, I went to Manus and made it to the front gate and was told the Chief Migration Officer would have an answer for me, and once he called me back and said Canberra said no, so I couldn't go in. So yeah.
That's important evidence for Australian proceedings.
I put it in a lot of stories for free.
There's a lady down the back who's had a hand up.
That previous question, nevertheless, is mine, which is that this general perception is that there is this queue that people who are now floundering in Manus Island and Nauru should have been waiting in the first place. As part of the discussion, are you able to do some sort of comparison between what the conditions are like in Manus that we're subjecting people to, compared to what it would have been like in a UNHCR refugee camp, where apparently this queue exists?
Kate, maybe? First of all, the only queue I've seen any evidence of is the queue where people on Manus wait in the direct sunlight for 2 or 3 hours, and some of them have collapsed waiting for meals. I mean, in some ways it's not really appropriate to compare conditions in Manus to a UNHCR camp, because the reality is if a human rights violation is happening, then that needs to change and that needs to be addressed. It doesn't matter if it's happening better or worse than another human rights violation. They really all need to be assessed as of their own right. And I can tell you that there are people in Manus who produced evidence to say that they were accepted as a refugee in UN camps, but they gave up waiting. So we spoke to one Somali person who was 20 years old, and he'd spent 10 years of his life in a UN camp with no chance of resettlement. And eventually he found a way to get together the money. Most of these people don't have the money. They borrow off, off the black market essentially, and their families are suffering back home trying to pay that off. But they do it because they, the risk to them is so great that they just need to flee, and they need to act urgently to do that. So, I think, we need to challenge some of these notions around, is there a queue out there, and what is it like? Because most of these people are coming from countries where they can't get flights out of the country. There is no UNHCR office in the country anyway, and they have to take risky journeys to find somewhere. And people are facing risks along the way, so it's not just the country of origin they're in, it's often the countries they transit through, be it Malaysia or Indonesia, where they are in fact persecuted because they don't have official documentation, which means they can't work, they can't sort of sustain any kind of livelihood there, and that's what's forcing them onto the boats.
I agree with Kate. The points that I'd add are, I haven't seen what conditions are like in refugee camps, but these are people who are on Manus because the Australian government, with all its wealth, has sent them there. So we should aim higher. And I don't think the UNHCR has inspected refugee camps all around the world, and its reports slam conditions inside Manus. They say they fail to meet international standards and that the conditions are inhumane. So I think that's damning enough for me. And on this notion of a queue, I think there's 10,500 registered asylum seekers in Indonesia at the moment. Something like 45 a month are resettled. And I'm no mathematician, but that's about, I think, 17 years that people would be waiting in Indonesia to be resettled. And in that time, they're at risk of being detained. They're not allowed to work. Their kids can't go to school. They don't have access to healthcare. It's a long time. I mean, that's a huge chunk of someone's life to live in limbo and live at risk of being locked up. So they make what's really not an unreasonable decision, and that's to risk their lives on a boat and go somewhere else. And the other thing is the UNHCR, to the extent that there is a queue, it's administered by the UN Refugee Agency. They process people and they try and resettle them elsewhere. Their budget for all of Southeast Asia is $166 million. In the most recent budget, Australia allocated $2.9 billion to our offshore processing policies. So we're spending $2.96 billion to try and deter people from getting on boats. The UN has $166 million to address the reasons why people get on them in the first place. So if we really want to solve the problem, we can do much more than try and frighten people away.
I think we might have time for just a couple more questions. There's a lady in the back corner and then we'll come to you last.
Hi, my name is James. I'm working from the City Peace Foundation. I'd be interested to find out what either is happening or what could happen in broadening the advocacy from just the legal constraints. For instance, is there a move to try and get the eminent PNG citizens of conscience who have an international standing to at least publicly back your efforts? Like someone like Carol Kiddu, for instance, who is well known and outspoken, and she may be doing it already, but we're not hearing it here.
Yep.
If you could talk to me about the wider campaign, I'd be really interested.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
I guess there are a number of challenges in that sense, working in PNG on any human rights issue. There is no single human rights organisation in PNG working at a national level, which means if I go there to work on sorcery-related killings and violence and things like that, there is no one, community group or organisation working on those issues, and that's something that PNG really lacks, is a vigorous civil society to respond to these issues. Of course, there are some smaller groups working in smaller provincial or community areas trying to address these things, and they're doing an amazing job. But that's one of the challenges, is finding a civil society organisation to engage with that has the capacity and the resources to look at an issue like this. In relation to Dame Carol Kiddu, the last I heard was that she was part of a resettlement committee appointed by government. So we're still waiting to see what the findings of that committee are. Having said that, I mean, I do have some confidence that she does know what standards of living are like in Papua New Guinea for the ordinary citizen. But there's also a risk in that, and I think that played out in the court case as well, is the comparator should not be, is Manus Island detention facility similar or better than a PNG prison, because that's not the standard that the Australian government should be aspiring to. I mean, we can adequately provide for the protection, the housing, the healthcare, the employment needs of these people in our country, and instead we're offloading that burden to another country. It is, one of the countries that has the biggest human rights challenges in the region, I think, in the whole Pacific. So it's just extraordinary that we see this as any kind of solution.
And it's shifting out the burden to much poorer nations with fewer resources as well. Yeah. Thank you. And we'll just go to the final question.
Yeah, thank you. Returning to the issue of mobilising Australian opinion here, I think the government has been so successful by its burlesque language and the way it uses, Operation Sovereign Borders, and now we hear about transferees. The whole thing is so obscene. And if we know, on the other hand, when people have an opportunity to connect with the humanity of refugees. I remember a number of years ago when there was the Afghani football team in rural and backwatch Australia, and how they connected with the community because this was a human connection. And we've got to find some way of circumventing this dehumanising process, which is very conscious on the government's part. That's just a comment.
I'll take that as a comment. Excellent. Now,
yeah, I have a comment on the comment. I think you're precisely right. The debate is, as it currently is an impediment to things changing, and we need to chip away at it. And I think the key challenge for people trying to influence public debate is that the government line is the ends justify the means. And it's very difficult to rebut that when they keep the means a secret. I mean, you can't say what we're doing to people on Manus, these conditions, they don't justify the ends because you just, I mean, up until recently, you don't have photos or information that you can show people to say that no, the ends don't justify the means. And the other strategy, I think, with trying to shift public opinion is, I mean, we can shout all day long about why we disagree with the labels and things that are being used in the public debate. The other strategy is to try and shape the people who shape the debate, and that's to work with like-minded politicians from all political parties, try and get them on side and persuade them to start speaking differently about this issue. And I think there's been positive developments on that front. We've started to see some Labor MPs break ranks and say we need to speak about this issue differently, we need to approach this issue differently. And I think over time, as more and more progressive politicians are emboldened and informed enough to take a different stance on this issue, we'll see public debate start to change as well.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really strong point for us to finish on. I will, in just a moment, hand over to the person who will be closing proceedings, but I did want to briefly acknowledge Jarrah Hoffman, one of our New South Wales conveners, for doing a wonderful job behind the scenes, and as our roving mate. Thank you very much for being so sprightly during that session. I'll now hand over to Michael Kingston, who is the chair of the board at the Human Rights Law Centre, for some closing comments and thank yous.
Thanks, Rosalind. Well, it's been a fascinating and perhaps for some of us at least an eye-opening discussion tonight, and I think it's provided a sobering, some might say depressing reflection on the effects of deliberate public policy, which many in our nation support. It's also, as you've heard a number of the speakers say repeatedly, been a reflection on the effects of putting people, both the refugees and those who are meant to be looking after them, beyond the reach of law and beyond the reach of scrutiny and what can happen when that occurs. And it may also be a reflection of the importance, when that happens, of people, brave people, making brave decisions and taking brave stances. And it may be Justice Canning will prove to be one of those people. This work that's been going on in relation to the inquiry is a good example, good illustration of the way the Human Rights Law Centre seeks to work, which is almost invariably in partnership with other organisations, often effective non-governmental organisations such as Amnesty International, and really terrific and supportive providers of pro bono legal services such as, in this case, King & Wood, Mallisons and the Bar, who both law firms and the Bar are remarkably generous with their time on often issues one might at first glance would think were unpopular or a bit too controversial to touch. Just whilst I'm standing up here and before I get to the thank yous, I also wanted to mention the 2014 Sydney Human Rights Dinner, which is taking place on Friday the 20th of June at the Great Hall at Sydney University. It's organised by the Human Rights Law Centre and Justice Connect. Our key speaker this year is the global human rights champion Hina Jilani. It's an opportunity for us to acknowledge and celebrate our commitment to and work in the human rights space, and if you're interested, I'd urge you to go to the Centre's website and consider coming along. Now, there's a few people to thank. First, I should say to Rosalind, thank you for a terrific job of marshalling the conversation in a way where I think we covered a lot of ground very effectively. I did want to thank King and Wood Mallesons not just for providing the venue tonight, but a lot more importantly for the work that's been put into this inquiry and surrounding issues. And I'd like you to join with me in thanking all four of our speakers. Somewhere under this podium there are 2 bottles of wine, not Untold Grange, sadly, although I understand that's the custom in New South Wales on these occasions, but something I suspect rather more modest for 2 of our speakers, Owen and Ben, who've come from organisations who aren't co-sponsors of tonight's venue. And rest assured, I will hand those over to you in just a minute. Finally, could I say thank you to our audience for coming tonight, for showing an interest in this issue, for wanting to learn more about it, for really addressing some of the issues about how do we change this conversation. And yes, the legal cases are important, but as a number of you pointed out, it's about a lot more than the legal cases. And your attendance tonight, I think, is a step in the direction we're seeking to take. So thank you very much.